Good morning, everybody. This is Dr. Taylor and Dr. Work with a lecture on wisdom. And I'm going to open us with a brief scripture reading, not a meditation, but just a reading to frame it, from Proverbs Chapter 3, 13 through 18. Happy are those who find wisdom and those who get understanding. For her income is better than silver, and her revenue better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. By the way, let's translate this into 2020. Her income is better than a high-paying job, better than a lucrative major and a valuable degree and a marketable GPA, and a steady career path. Nothing we desire can compare with her, not even our standing with our friends and our colleagues and our peers. These are radical claims, y'all. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called happy. Let me frame this really briefly before we jump into the wisdom literature. First of all, the what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, is a three-part series. Part one is the Torah, or the law. Part two, the Nevi'im, or the prophets. And part three are the writings, or the Ketuvim, which literally just means writings in Hebrew. And you might think, wait, writings, I mean, they're all writings. All three parts are writings. The reason this is just called writings and why it's such a diverse collection, this is the material in the Jewish scriptures that doesn't fit into the other collections of law and prophets. So it's like that drawer in your kitchen that has all the stuff that doesn't fit in any other drawer. It's just the miscellany, all right? The writings are the miscellany of the Old Testament. They're that all-purpose drawer that you put things in that don't belong anywhere else. And in the Jewish Old Testament, I don't call it the Old Testament, obviously, in the Jewish Bible, here are the books that are in the writings: Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, all familiar to us. They're in that same section of our Old Testaments. But then some others that we have pulled somewhere else: Ruth, Lamentations, also Ecclesiastes, and also more books that we put with the prophets: Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. The Greek Septuagint, which is the Jewish Bible translated into Greek, and then the Christian Old Testament, takes some of these writings and pull them into what they call the former prophets, the histories, and the latter prophets, which are the major and minor prophets. And so we are going to focus on so the writings that Christians know as part of that section of the Old Testament are Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. I'm not going to talk about the Psalms because we're going to focus today on wisdom literature. The wisdom literature in the writings of the Old Testament. And I want you to think of this material as Israel's coach. If you've had a good coach in a sport, a good coach doesn't just give you exercises, doesn't just give you technique. A good coach trains your judgment as an athlete. Same in music. A mentor or a music teacher isn't just teaching you technique, but what depends on technique, which is your style, your character as a musician, and your ability to play well.
Telford, I have just a question. Isn't that in a way the distinction between skill and virtue?
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So wisdom literature is training not just in skill, but in virtue, which uses skill and in some ways depends on skill, but which cannot be reduced to skill. Thanks.
You bet.
And so a mentor, a coach, that is what the wisdom literature is about. And it comes from the coaches of Israel, the sages, those who passed along the wisdom they had accumulated. And they didn't just make these observations, they embodied the wisdom that they gained. So a wise person isn't just someone who offers, a good coach is also a good athlete, maybe past his or her prime, but still a good athlete. Wisdom literature of the Bible is one thing that just jumps out at you as you read it in the next week or so is how apparently contradictory it is. What do I mean by that? Well, Proverbs gives you this really great formula. If you live well and live wisely, you're going to prosper, right? In wisdom's left hand are riches and prosperity. And if you live a foolish life, you're gonna regret it. Your life is going to be a train wreck, and you're gonna suffer the consequences of your folly. But then it gives you the story of Job, who lived that good and wise and faithful life, and who suffers. What gives? And then it gives you Ecclesiastes, which says, yeah, that's all true, but we all end up in the same graveyard at the end of our life. And the fool is buried right next to the sage. And we all end up in the same Sheol, the same grave. So really, the value of wisdom is kind of temporal. That's what Ecclesiastes says. What do you do with this conflicting information? What do we do with this conflicting information? Well, if you're an athlete or if you're a musician, your coach is giving you advice, and any one piece of advice may conflict with some other piece of advice. And when you were a beginner, that was probably really frustrating. Wait, you just told me this, and now you're telling me that? Here's two little pearls of wisdom. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. That sounds a lot like Song of Songs, by the way. Or out of sight, out of mind. If you neglect and you're distant from someone, your relationship will decline. Well, how can those both be true? They seem to contradict. Wisdom trains judgment, because you need to know when a particular bit of wisdom applies and when it doesn't. And that's why it's a virtue, not just a skill. It's not a formula. So the collection of Israel's wisdom literature honors that complexity of life and the unpredictability of life and the fact that we just don't live out a formula. The extremism of the wisdom literature also honors the intensity of life. Life might have a lot of dull moments, but it also has a lot of white knuckle moments. So I think the complexity of the wisdom literature is a feature that accomplishes something. It forces us to depend on the coaching of the wise. And in doing that, it grows us up. It's, we don't just learn a formula. We learn how to walk a fruitful life that makes us better people, more virtuous people. And so the kind of relationship that we gain in living the wise life is a relationship of, and this is an Old Testament term, sonship. It's actually even more a New Testament term. It builds the relationships of inheritance that Israel's people enjoy by being people of the covenant. And I'm using the word sonship because in the ancient Near East and in the Greco-Roman world, the system was a lot more strictly patriarchal, and sons inherited the estates from their fathers. So So, the tribes of Jacob are all the sons of Jacob, and so on. Proverbs is structured as a father's advice to a son. So does that mean that women don't need to read it and live by it? Well, of course not. Particularly in a less patriarchal era or culture. And even more radically, when Jesus comes as the only son of the Father, he shares his sonship, right? He is the heir who inherits all things from the Father. He shares his inheritance with all of his followers, and we all become sons. We have received the spirit of sonship, Paul says. Women as well as men. So for us to keep the wisdom literature is for us to become the kinds of people who are worthy of inheriting what God intends to give his people. In the Old Testament, that means we become worthy Israelites. We become a generation that's able to be trustees of the covenant and pass it on. Whereas if we live a foolish life, we aren't just going to suffer personally, we are going to be unworthy of inheriting that covenant. And, if you own a business, you're not going to pass your business on to people who are going to destroy it and squander it. You're going to pass it on to heirs who are able to hold it, to receive it, and to increase its prosperity. And that's what a lot of the language of inheriting the kingdom of God is about in the New Testament. We who acquire the virtues of sonship, so to speak, through God's grace, we will be inheriting the kingdom. And if we don't do that, if we don't bother to do that, then we're going to be dismissed. Okay? That New Testament language is all drawing on this Old Testament context. And so is the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Okay. The genres in the writings, and I'm going to focus on four pieces of wisdom literature for this lecture. They often tend to reduce humanity to two types. I mentioned the extremism of the literature, which reflects the intensity of life, but it also it functions in a certain way. All right. These books tend to see us as falling into one or another type. However, what those two types are and what distinguishes them differs in each group. Here's what I mean. So here's a table. It has columns for Psalms and Daniel. I'm going to ignore them, but if you want, you can look at them and see how in those other books of the writings, a similar thing is happening. In a given book, you get a vision of the goal or the telos or the end of life, the purpose of life. In Proverbs, the goal of life is flourishing, right? Every parent wants the children to flourish. And our hearts are just glad when our kids are doing well, and our hearts hurt, bleed when they're struggling and doing poorly. All right, flourishing is the telos in the book of Proverbs. And the good life. Here's my fancy internet graphic. The good life consists of righteousness in the book of Proverbs. So that's type 1. The bad life consists of wickedness as opposed to righteousness. So there are really two groups, the righteous and the wicked. And trial, all right, the testing that presses you towards one or another, or manifests who you really are, whether you're really wise or really a fool, that trial consists in Proverbs of passion, impulsivity, the part of our nature that just wants something now. And that impulsivity produces temptation to do wrong. Follow your impulses, and you will engage in wickedness, and you will suffer ruin. Whereas, hang on to wisdom and walk the right path, and you will resist, and resist those temptations and temper your impulses. Temperance is a virtue as well. You will lead a life of righteousness that will bring flourishing. Okay, that's the formula of Proverbs. Each wisdom book has its own picture of those two types and the trials that manifest who you are and also influence who you become. In Ecclesiastes, which at least our section is reading for today, you get a very different picture than you do in Proverbs. Instead of flourishing, life is what? What's the goal of life? Well, vanity, vanity. All is vanity. All is emptiness or pointlessness. I think that's a good English word here. And by the way, I'm using material from a book that Jim's in my section is reading called 3 Philosophies of Life by Peter Kraft. Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, you were saying that in Ecclesiastes, vanity or futility is the goal of life, not certainly what we're striving for, not that sense of a goal, right?
Great, yeah.
Actually, where things end up.
That's right. It's unavoidable. There are goals that you don't want, but you're still headed towards them.
Yeah. So the end result, maybe in spite of our chosen and subjective purpose or goal.
Yeah. The end. Yeah, the end of our life in the sense of the outcome.
The outcome. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
You bet. Which is a really different take than you get in Proverbs. So what is the good life? If life is pointlessness, well, the good life in Ecclesiastes seems to be, on the one hand, contentment. You might as well live with it as long as this is what it is. But Kohelet, the teacher, the preacher, the figure who's sharing this wisdom, the sage of Ecclesiastes, we think is better off for knowing that. If you realize the futility of life, at least you're not living a lie while you're headed to the inevitable goal that we all end up in. And so you might say that the good life, it's only a little better than the bad life, is illumination. We have a deeper insight into the nature of this pointless life that we live. Whereas the bad life is heedlessness, right? To be heedless is just to be stubborn and determined to really kind of fight reality. And the nature of trial, on the one hand, life is toil, it's work, it's the sweat of your brow that God talks about in Genesis 3. And trial consists in noticing stuff about the world that disappoints, right? You want to think that this adds up to more, but if everything is vanity, then observing the pointlessness of it is actually going to produce, it's going to produce the opportunity to go in either of these directions. Either I can learn illumination and become content with the cards that were dealt, with the reality that we're in, or I can say, forget it. I can just throw it all off and lead a life of short-term hedonism that yields quicker destruction and more misery in the meantime, even if I end up in the same place. So observing and then reflecting on what we observe in our life of toil really constitutes the form of trial in Ecclesiastes. Yeah, Jim.
So are you going to say something about how it is that we've got a book in the Bible that says that life is pointless?
I don't know. I'll remember your question. Maybe I'll bring it in.
Okay.
Maybe it's something for students to struggle with. What is this book doing here? Um, it does not seem like we would want to put it in the Bible, but it's there. Um, yeah, maybe I'll work it in. In Job, you get a different vision, right? Um, the what is the nature and the end of life? Well, it's complicated. Kraft highlights life as suffering. Life is suffering, right? And by the way, in this book, Kraft isn't just saying life has some vanity or some pointlessness. Life includes some seasons of suffering, and life includes moments of love. He calls these three things metaphysical moods. He says that each book gives you a picture of reality in which life is that. So a metaphysical mood is a really nice term to say, if I'm if I have a constructive, charitable, optimistic mindset, life is good. Life is good. And even when bad things come my way, I'm going to frame them in terms of my understanding that life is good. And I'm going to see them in terms of that metaphysical mood. Whereas if I'm a pessimist, and if I wake up on the wrong side of the bed that day and I just think life is bad, then it's not just that I had a bad day, it's that on that bad day I see what life really is. So these are more sweeping, radical claims than just life features this stuff. Life is suffering. But the goal of suffering can be something besides punishment for guilt. Job's friends think Job is being punished for something he did. So they really think life is justice. And Job must have done something, some injustice that brings about his misfortune, his suffering. But Job doesn't leave us there. So you get the idea that the goal of life is actually not just endless suffering, and it's not even just karma, where the wicked are punished and the righteous prosper. The goal of life moves beyond suffering to Job's vindication and blessing. And that means that the good life looks like faithfulness. Job stays faithful. He holds on. He perseveres. And his character changes because, I'm going to jump over to Paul in the New Testament, because suffering produces hope. Through the grace of God, suffering doesn't just leave us miserable. It can yield endurance, character, and hope, which doesn't disappoint us, because God is coming through on his promises.
Did you define purgation?
I did not. Sorry. Purging that which doesn't belong. So refining. When we talk about refining so that the dross separates from the good metal, that's purging. Purging it of what doesn't belong. So you might say that Job experiences purgation in his suffering. He's refined through the process, through that miserable process. The bad life is, on the one hand, I'm going to actually skip to this, presumption. Job's friends presume a conclusion that isn't warranted, and so they become torturers. Even though they came to comfort Job, they end up torturing him. So they represent the bad life, rushing to judgment, or being resigned to suffering, and at the cost of one's integrity. So Job's wife says, look at you. You're living the worst possible life. Why don't you just curse God and die? Why don't you just get it over with? That's a kind of complacency or resignation to life as suffering. And that's not a good life. That's a bad life. Job here embodies a good life of worship and deference to God and faithfulness to God, even when everything is wrong. And trial then becomes, on the one hand, affliction, right? The suffering, the plague, the loss of his family, the loss of his prosperity and his security. And on the other hand, trial, for most of the book, becomes his friends with their lousy theology. Actually, a lot of it's good theology, but it's misplaced. It's being used poorly. You might say, back up here, that Job's friends have the skills, they have the theological skills to know how to connect dots, but they don't have the judgment to recognize which dots are really the dots that are connecting. So, good theology gone wrong is one of life's trials. That kind of hits me hard. And then a third set of two things, a third picture, life as love in Song of Songs. Love is really the one thing that animates the characters in Song of Songs. The good life, on the one hand, is a life of love. It's a life of desire. The lover and the beloved, they desire one another, and it's better to do that than not to do that. Although it's also better to hold it off, right? Don't awaken love until it so desires. So you don't have to date right away. Nevertheless, being in that relationship of desire, once you're there, they don't say daughters of Jerusalem, go ahead and quench love because it's better not to love. The good life is a life of desire, but fulfilled desire, fulfilled in unity, the presence of the lover and the beloved, and the consummation of their relationship, the fulfillment of their desire together. Whereas the bad life looks like isolation, right? The bad life looks like, love torn apart produces suffering. And that's the Song of Songs is not a stoic work. It's not just, hey, you can become better through, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You can become better having lost the love of your life. No, that's just painful and bad and to be avoided. And another thing to avoid, speaking of stoicism, is resignation to not having it and the indifference toward the other that a broken relationship yields. So those are my terms for the good life picture and the bad life picture. And the trial then is, in the Song of Songs, it's distance. It's a long distance relationship. And that might be physical distance, and sometimes it's portrayed that way in the book. Sometimes it's emotional distance, relational distance. How will we deal with distance in our love? Will it produce the desire for reunity? Or will we medicate and cope with it with indifference and extinguish the relationship? And now, Song of Songs is about a man and a woman, but the church reads this and says, well, if Christ is our bridegroom and we are the bride, then this is also a picture of the kind of relationship with God that we want, and also that in terms of indifference and isolation, we desperately want to avoid. What will we do with distance from God? Will it become a vehicle of further desire or a vehicle of isolation? Jim? You're muted.
Is the book about both human love and divine love then?
It is literally about human love. There's nothing in the book that suggests that it's about divine love. So you have to read it as on the one hand, you have to read its plain meaning, I think, as human sexual love. But you can ask whether that has implications, especially when a sexual metaphor like the wedding feast of the Lamb or the bridegroom and the bride, Christ and his church. When a relationship is likened to that kind of sexual relationship of marriage, then you have to ask whether Song of Songs has implications for those other relationships, and above all, our relationship with God, which is put in those terms once in a while. And you can characterize a relationship in a lot of different ways. On the one hand, wisdom literature is building relationships of sonship or inheritance. We are, Paul says, sons of God, right? Co-heirs with Christ. And that puts us in relationships of sonship to the Father. But we are also his body, and he's the head. And that's a different kind of symbol of the relationship. And we are also his bride. And he is the bridegroom. That's in the Gospels and in Paul and in Revelation. So we have complicated relationships with our Creator, and no one image is really going to say it all, and so no one relationship really ought to dominate. And again, I think this is part of the genius of the wisdom literature, is that it knows that life is deeper than any one of these typologies. All of these typologies are useful and true. And having more of them in our imagination in life is going to enrich our skill set, and virtue will show us when each of these is kind of in the front stage or the front burner, and which are in the backstage or the back burner, which ones are coming to the fore and which ones might be receding into the background at a given moment in life. That's how I'm going to say we can think of the collection together. Okay. So that's, I'm not done yet, but that's a guide to the 3 books, whichever 3 our sections are reading, and a proposal for how you can begin to think about putting them together. All right. We tend to think of these privately in terms of my life. I want to flourish. I want my life not to be pointless, or at least I need to deal with its real pointlessness. I want my suffering to yield vindication. I want God's love and maybe a companion's love. But I want you to see that this is Israel's wisdom literature. Israel is God's inheriting people. So this is not just an exercise in individual training. Living the good life brings each of these blessings, not just on a wise person, but on that person's family, neighborhood, city, people. And really, since Israel is the showcase people for the world, it brings that blessings through Israel to the world. Living the bad life doesn't just ruin your life, it ruins the lives of others around you. Can I get a witness, maybe? It brings ruin and death, not just to the fool, but to the fool's social groups. And that can radiate outward to the whole world. And life's trials, like I've said, can move us. Not only do they manifest our character, they can also shape our character and move us in one direction or the other. And we're not entirely in control of that process. So I don't want you to think that, we're in the driver's seat determining whether a trial pushes us in one direction or another. Some of these trials are so powerful that they overwhelm us. So Israel's future, not just a person's future, but Israel's future, depends on cultivating wisdom in its traditions and in its individual persons. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that we're not always completely in control of the outcome of our struggles, either as individuals or as groups. But I do want you to emphasize again, in light of what you just said, that we do have some role to play. We do have free will, God-given free will, and we're held accountable. We're responsible for how we use it in the shaping of our individual and collective characters.
Uh, yeah, this is complicated. We have will, we have agency. You might say some of our agency is, sometimes our agencies are weaker than others. Some people's agency is weaker than others. Going back to this metaphor of a coach, poor coaching or abusive or dysfunctional coaching or mentoring can really ruin an impressionable person's life in ways that that person is not in a position to control. And some of those relationships you can walk away from. If your teacher is a bad teacher, the add drop deadline hasn't passed yet, so you can get out of the relationship. But some you can't. If you're the child of a parent, you can't just walk away. So this is actually going to be one of the aporias later on with this wisdom literature, is who has the power, how much power do we have, and who has sufficient power to take control of their life when trials come.
Tell us what an aporia is.
Oh, an aporia is a problem that actually I should let you, because you probably, being a philosopher, have a better grasp on the definition.
You're right. So an aporia is a problem, but it's a problem with no easy or clear solution, because it looks like two contrary things are true, and it's hard to see how to figure out your way out of that paradox. So for instance, we're going to ask our students to look in the text they're reading for ways in which the author seems to contradict himself or herself, and ways to see whether or not there's a deeper reading of the text that can show that they're not really inconsistent after all. That there's a reading that shows that it's consistent in spite of the appearance of inconsistency.
Great. And that would be solving an aporia by finding that there really is coherence. But if I just write a bad book, that apparent inconsistency might actually reveal a fatal flaw in my argument.
That's true. Although, since these are classic works that have endured the test of time, it's less likely that they'll be chock full of genuine inconsistencies. And that's why we need to exercise charity in reading them, to assume that the author is being consistent, unless we can't figure out a way to show that.
Amen. That's right. So you might think of our sources as coaches, and we're asking critical questions about our coaches, but that doesn't mean that we are level with our coaches in our skill or our virtue. So, but we gain skill and virtue by exercising that kind of critical thinking, right? So this is kind of like wrestling. You get stronger by wrestling. And as a dad, I would wrestle with my kids. We had games at home when they were little, and I would not overpower them, but I would challenge them, and they would increasingly challenge me as I got older and more of them. And play like that is how we get stronger.
Yeah.
Even when it's the relationship is unequal. So that's a great point. We need to exercise humility, but we need to exercise. We need to grow our skills of judgment, and that's gonna mean making some mistakes along the way, thinking that we've identified a problem only to find out there was a solution to it, or thinking there's no problem only to find out that there actually really is a problem.
So yeah, really a balance we need to strive to strike as we go along between humility and teachability and respect for the authority of the author as our coach on the one hand, and discernment, judgment, critical thinking, because our coaches, after all, are, unless it's God, unless it's Jesus, our coaches are fallible, even if they're more likely to be wise than we are.
Right. And even if they're infallible, human beings learn by working and struggling and playing. And so again, I think when you look at the wisdom literature, it's inviting you into an active relationship where it's inviting us to wrestle with God the way Jacob wrestled. And we might get injured along the way, but it's the only way to become the people we need to become. So anyway, thank you for those comments. I love them. And I think they are true, certainly of fallible coaches like Augustine and Teresa and the rest, but they're even true of infallible coaches. I think Jesus wants us to wrestle, which is crazy. But if we're the kinds of beings that need to wrestle, it also makes perfect sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. So here's some questions that I'm going to invite you to ponder and even just pause and reflect. Maybe in a small group, we might come to these on Tuesday in our time together. Ponder or even discuss in small groups. First of all, you could explore the moral vision of one, or actually I'm saying two of these columns, using any one of our three key questions. What's human nature and how do we flourish? How can reliable knowledge be faithfully acquired? What virtues are to be pursued and which vices avoided and why? You could compare and contrast any two of these columns and see if we gave you a paper on Ecclesiastes or on Song of Songs, how would you write that paper? And I'd also like you to consider I'd like you to consider this device of putting everybody in two groups, two extremes, the wise and the fool. Is that a good idea? Why is it a good idea? Why is it not a good idea? Where are the strengths and where are the weaknesses or vulnerabilities of this trope, of this device? Because you might be thinking along the way, I have moments of wisdom, but I have moments of real folly. And so I don't know which category I belong in, and I don't know whether I belong in one of those categories, and I don't know whether it's helpful that those are my only two options. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that? Here's a few other aporias, difficult problems with wisdom literature. The first one, can folly's momentum really be overcome? Can you really just, can you move from the fool category to the sage category? We certainly have a lot of examples of people who don't. Is our will adequate to take us from the bad life to the good life? Does anyone measure up to the category of sage? Is anyone truly wise? Or is that ideal type unattainable? I certainly do not measure up, and as I grow in years, I don't feel like I'm measuring up better than I did. And maybe that's accurate, maybe it's not, but I'm still pretty keenly aware of the gap between where I need to be, the goal and the good life, and where I actually am. Does anyone measure up? I've already mentioned how do we relate these various strands? I gave them to you and said, here they are. Is there a bigger picture that's getting drawn out of this? Kraft has a schema in Three Philosophies of Life. He says Ecclesiastes is hell, Job is purgatory, Song of Songs is heaven. Ecclesiastes is a book of faith, but really the mirror image. Job is a book of hope, and Song of Songs is obviously a book of love. All right. Here's a third category: frustration, humiliation, exaltation. And so he wants us to see these as a sequence. He wants to see us as traveling a course through these insightful works, knowing that life is all of these, but finally life is love, not suffering, and certainly not vanity. But your mileage may vary. How would you relate these strands? And if you're reading Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job, how do those relate to each other? You're gonna need a different schema with those different books than a different set of books. And finally, this is coming really from the really from all three. They pay out in this final question or aporia. If this is Israel's coaching to produce worthiness to inherit the covenant and inherit the blessings of the covenant, will all of this nurture save Israel? It doesn't seem to. If there are just a lot of fools, and in 2020, I see that, including when I look in the mirror, then will all of this nurture, all this coaching save Israel, save God's people, or will it just save a few elites, a few exemplars who finally manage to follow its paths of wisdom? As the disciples asked Jesus, will many be saved or will few be saved? Is this coaching really just for the A team and the rest of us are the B team or the C team or off the team? And if so, what does that mean for us? So here are some problems or aporias that I identify, and I'm offering you these as an example of the kind of work you'll be doing when you read Confessions. Where's an aporia? Where's an apparent difficulty? If I can find aporias with Scripture, you can find them in Confessions. And another puzzle. The Bible is often likened to a narrative, a grand narrative, with Genesis being our beginning, with Revelation being our very end, and we're going through it like a 5-act play. You'll hear that in New Testament, you'll hear that in Old Testament, all right? And some people are going to say that really the Bible comes down to a narrative. This is really all God's story, and we just are playing roles in God's story. And so story becomes, or narrative becomes, the framework in which we understand everything. Well, here I want to point out a complexity. Here, the story of Job, the story of Kohelet, the teacher, the story of the wise father, and the story of the lover and the beloved is embedded in something deeper. Kraft calls these metaphysical moods, which is saying they have metaphysical relevance. They are exposing the deep structure of reality, which is deeper than the narratives. The narratives tap into that metaphysical structure. They manifest it in a way in wisdom literature that suggests that there's something deeper than narrative. A kind of deep logic to the creation, and maybe a deep logic in the essence of God, who's responsible for that creation. So as you encounter narrative theology, as you encounter the claims that story is really the ultimate Christian way to understand reality, should a truly biblical Christian perspective look beyond that narrative framework to something deeper, like eternal truths or principles? There's a battleground in my field and in the philosophical field about how, whether philosophy is ultimate or whether principles are ultimate or history is ultimate. Or is nothing ultimate? Is there no final one framework that encloses everything? These are pretty deep questions, maybe a little too much to chew on right now, but I'm going to invite you, whether you're watching this in groups or in solitude, I would invite you to pause the recording and reflect on this before we move on to the next thing. Take a break and ponder before you just rush to the next section. And we'll return to the next section about wisdom herself, Jesus Christ. Actually, I should back up a little bit and say, I have a graphic here to show you. It's not just Old Testament wisdom that embeds story in something that seems deeper than just story. Jesus is a great coach. Jesus is a sage. He's not just a sage, but among other things, he's a sage. And in the Gospels, you see parables of the kingdom, some of which are are like this in suggesting something deeper than just a story playing out. Here's Matthew 7 from the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not going to go into the details. We don't have enough time. I just want you to see that, first of all, the crowds see in Jesus' teaching unparalleled authority. And there is a persistent contrast in the Sermon on the Mount, particularly the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, where Jesus, on the one hand, is telling his people, beware, avoid, okay? And this is the fool side of the ledger. Hypocrites, people who cast pearls before swine, the many on the wide road, false prophets, hypocrites who plead Lord but ignore their Father's will. Anyone who builds on anything but his word. Those are all the bad life, right? Those are all exemplars and coaches in bad life. Instead, be all these other things. I put these in color so that you can see the resemblance across the verses. And I'm not gonna linger on this. I just want you to see for a moment Jesus the sage. I want you to see Jesus embodying the practical wisdom of the kingdom and warning us against the practical folly all around us and in us. So that's a hook into what Jesus does with all this stuff. I don't want to leave us in the Old Testament wisdom literature as if the subject ends there. Jesus Christ is the good life in person, right? He brings it, he lives it, he includes us in it through his grace. In every case, in each one of these bodies of literature, Jesus fulfills the moral, right? The teaching of that book. And in fact, he even fulfills the genre of that book, the kind of argument it is. He embodies and assimilates it. He personifies its vision of the good life. He endures its vision of the trial. He suffers its bad life. And he fulfills its goal for himself, but also for those he loves. And those he loves in the Gospels are demonstrably unworthy of it. They are failures. So they do not attain the good life in order to inherit the good life. They receive the grace of sharing in his personified good life. And that's, I don't have a ton of time, but I wanna give you an example in each case of how Jesus fulfills that book of wisdom literature. I've just reproduced each column in small type from up above. If we are in Proverbs, and if we're in the world and the metaphysic of Proverbs with flourishing, righteousness, and passion and impulse and temptation leading us either there or to wickedness, then Jesus is God's wisdom, his eternal wisdom, whose foolish disclosure, foolish teaching about reality exposes our true folly. All right? The light shines in the darkness, John says. John 1:118 casts Jesus as not just the Word that was with God and was God, through whom all things were made, but casts Jesus in the image of Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 8, the beginning of all things, who is to be, whose wisdom structures everything and is kind of latent in everything and perceptible in everything. John is saying, wow, the wisdom of creation, which came from its creator, that creator wisdom that was in the beginning before creation, because creation is structured to reflect it, that Lady Wisdom became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen wisdom's glory.
Is the part about foolish revealing revealing exposes our true folly, is that a reference to 1 Corinthians 1 and 2?
It sure is. I thought I would include that because Paul treats Jesus as the true wisdom of God, who is so different from the wisdom that we expect, that his coming disrupts our notions of what's wise. And we learn that what we thought was wise is actually folly. And we thought Jesus was folly, right? Jesus didn't make sense to the people around him. They rejected him. They misunderstood him. They distorted him. They maligned him. And so the wise, the so-called wise, turn out to be fools. And the so-called fool, labeled by him, turns out to be the wisdom of God. So you'll get a nice long exposure to that passage in 1 Corinthians that Jim mentioned at the end of the semester. But yeah, this is a preview of coming attractions. And this is a way to say something that I skipped at first. The way that Jesus reveals and fulfills the shape of wisdom literature is disruptive. He doesn't just slide right in and slot into everybody's expectation. He doesn't just arrive and everybody goes, oh, look, the sage, the coach, and everyone just falls right in line. He arrives and his kingdom approaches and he issues this invitation to enter, and people are like, no. And Jesus's wisdom is not just a kind of smooth building on Israel's scriptures. He disrupts the partial, distorted, false, destructive traditions of understanding those very things in his ministry. And that's why the word foolish is in quotes. That'll take some unpacking, I'm sure, in sections. If we are in the world of Ecclesiastes, where life is vanity, Jesus's work is to affirm creation's vanity, right? He exposes the pointlessness of a lot of the things that we try so hard at, right? Why are you trying to amass wealth when you're going to die and you can't take it with you? What are you doing? What are you thinking, right? But he offers something beyond life's vanity. You're going after earthly treasure and ordering your whole life around it. I'm offering you treasure that lasts beyond this life, treasure in heaven, secure in Fort Knox. Go for that. It doesn't rust. It doesn't depreciate. So Jesus bypasses the futility of old creation, and Jesus inherits the eternal remade creation of the new heaven and earth, and we can inherit with him. So you might say that Jesus doesn't refute Ecclesiastes. Jesus transcends Ecclesiastes. He honors the truth of Ecclesiastes while pointing beyond Ecclesiastes. By enduring its futility, by taking on its futility in his death. If we're in the world of Job, then Jesus is Job. He is the one who's perfectly righteous, who suffers in his righteousness, who suffers the misunderstanding and the distortion of his friends, and who triumphs over not just that misunderstanding, but over the accuser beneath it all. Revelation 12 talks about Satan being cast out of heaven, and I wonder whether Job is underneath that. Because in the book of Job, Satan makes this accusation, and then he's humiliated at the end of the story. And there's no scene later to show it to us. To show us in a way, what does Satan have to stand on after Job has triumphed and after God has vindicated him? He doesn't have anywhere to stand. And that's Jesus's picture of his own ministry in John 12. When the Son of Man is lifted up, the ruler of this world is cast out. So I think Jesus is Job eternalized. And I actually think Job is giving you a picture of redemptive suffering in the fact that Job's accuser is discredited and disempowered, disarmed. And Jesus accomplishes that. He's the one who does that work and inherits and enjoys forever the vindication, restoration, and glorification of God. Job is just a picture of that. If we're in Song of Songs, where life comes down to love, then Jesus is, I've already mentioned this, Jesus is the bridegroom who calls the bride, perfects the bride, and marries the bride. Who's the bride? The people of God, Israel, church. Overcoming the distance of our rejection with his own grace and his own remaking work to make us spotless and pure. And that's Ephesians 5. That's also, very briefly, that's how Paul characterizes the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 11. All right. If we're in the world of Song of Songs, Jesus is the lover, and we are the beloved. So, astonishing, I think. And if you want to look at Psalms, Daniel, and even the New Testament wisdom book of James, you can see the same pattern in their own worlds, in their own pictures of reality. Jesus is the only wise heir of all that the Father has. That's how he describes it in John 16 on the night that he's betrayed. So he is that worthy son inheriting what wisdom is preparing the wise to inherit. So I think this offers an answer. Jesus alone offers an answer to that aporia up here. What should be the fundamental framework? Narrative seems like a really good candidate, only it seems more complicated than just narrative. What is the final framework? The church's conclusion, which is the Bible's conclusion, is that there's no greater framework than wisdom. Wisdom is Jesus. Wisdom is the second person of the Trinity. All right? Wisdom is no less than and no other than God himself. So although narrative honors and discloses the character of that triune God, God isn't just narrative. And although principles, eternal truths, although those reflect the triune God in Jesus Christ, they aren't above the triune God. Jesus is the framework in which we see life, all of these forms of life fulfilled. Okay? And not just manifested, but accomplished. So his virtue, that's Proverbs language. His worship, that's the Psalms. His transcendence in Ecclesiastes. His disarming vindication that disempowers the accuser from Job. His unity with his people, that's Song of Songs. All of those release, they don't just glorify him, they release the riches of wisdom, which I described at the beginning of the lecture. The stuff that's better than gold, better than everything you value in your ordinary world. That's all pointless compared to the surpassing riches that Jesus releases to his needy ones. Wow, glory to him. So wisdom has made a way to triumph over and through and in the midst of our folly. Wisdom has supplied us with the grace that converts trials into virtue, right? Suffering into hope. Pointlessness into transcendence. And we are in her debt. Here's a picture, two pictures actually, that I want to show you of wisdom as the second person of the Trinity. The first one, these are both Orthodox icons. This is a Russian-American Orthodox icon. And what you see here is, I'm going to focus on this part of the screen. Well, you see Mary, who brings Jesus. You see John the Baptist, who announces Jesus. And you see Jesus here. Who's this? Who's this lady? This is Lady Wisdom. And the Greek here tells you Hagia Sophia, I should say. Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom. And notice these labels, Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom, are not just here next to this shining, crimson angelic lady. It's Jesus who is the wisdom of God. There's an association, a close association here between the two. And that gets even more radical in the next picture, the next icon, where they are made one. Holy wisdom, this radiant angelic lady, is no other than Jesus of Nazareth. All right? Jesus is Lady Wisdom. These are both Russian Orthodox icons from a very traditional church, which nevertheless is ready to portray Jesus this way to make this point, okay? Wisdom is none other than the second person of the Trinity. And so keeping this literature, and by keeping, I mean not just reading and knowing it, but living it. Keeping this literature trains his disciples in his likeness, all right? As long as we do so in the context of his lordship, all right? As long as we keep this literature in light of his lordship, because he is the one who fulfills them, right? He's the one who demonstrates the definitive shape of biblical wisdom. Then when we keep it under his coaching, we gain his character. That's the role that Jesus the coach grants to his literature for our sanctification and perfection.